Yes, hello, my name is Jordan Hayes. I am presenting our paper along with Smirity Kaushik, my co-author. This is also a joint venture with Charlotte Price and Yang Wang. And today we'll be talking about the ethnographic study that we conducted over the last few years, where we attempted to understand the privacy and security practices of adults with visual impairments and their allies. So first, it's important to be cognizant, and reflexive about our position as researchers about the limitations and the biases that we may encounter, especially working with people who have marginalized identities, such as people with disabilities and visual impairments. Our research team consists of a mix of genders and ethnicities. We work with a group of cisgender men and women. We also have Asians, South Asians, Caucasians, and Asian Americans on the team. I myself have a disability, but this is not necessarily the same as visual impairments. It is not the same as visual impairments. So what we try our best to do is understand our participants' experiences. We always realize there are some limitations. So we respect and give voice to our participants' experiences and their ways of living. So before we get into the study itself, I have three main takeaways to share with you. First and foremost, some participants have other disability identities. For example, one person has bipolar disorder, the other is hard of hearing. These additional identities, along with their visual impairments, present challenges that are very interesting for our participants' privacy and security. These different aspects of their marginalized identities intersect and influence these participants' experiences. So, in other words, just looking at the visual impairments themselves does not tell the entire story. And lastly, we advocate for feature designs to incorporate some aspect of cooperative privacy and security. And what that is visual impaired participants and their allies work together to protect the privacy and security. Our background and motivation for the study is this. First of all, existing end user mechanisms and designs for privacy don't really consider the needs of users with visual impairments. For example, if you take a look at that lock icon in the browser, some screen readers, if not all of them, miss this. And what that means is users with visual impairments are most likely to miss this important information, and they're more vulnerable to privacy and security risks. And that is why our long-term goal is to design privacy and security mechanisms that are inclusive to users with visual impairments, to considering their needs in future designs. And then third, our existing studies cover the privacy and security concerns of people with visual impairments. But what our study does is really dive deep into the interactions between the users with visual impairments and their allies. We feel as though that's the novelty of the study, and allies could be such people as family members, friends, and service providers. This leads us to our two research questions. Number one, what are the everyday privacy and security challenges and practices of people with visual impairments? And number two, how do people with visual impairments interact with their allies? What are the privacy and security implications of such interactions? As far as our methodology, we conducted an ethnographic research method which consists of shadowing and observation, and that allowed us to immerse ourselves in and understand our participants' daily life. And we realized this method would allow us to obtain interesting insights that participants may not disclose during a formal interview. But we also wanted to understand the background and the context behind our observations, so that is also why we included semi-structured interviews and scenarios tasks sandwiched between the observation and shadowing sessions. We did a total of 13 sessions, each over a 2-day period during the weekend and the weekday, in order to get an idea for what their home and work life was like. And we studied the interactions between visually impaired participants and their allies, because we felt that's an important aspect of our participants' daily life. We recruited a total of 8 participants, 4 male, 4 female. 3 of them were blind, 2 had low vision, and 3 of them were allies. We used flyers and email solicitation, as well as distributed emails through local disability community mailing lists to people with disabilities. We also visited service organizations who provided help to people with disabilities. I want to point out that it was challenging to recruit populations of this nature, not just for this study, but for other studies in general, mainly because of the long hours and time commitment that was required for this study. But I also want to say that in general, recruiting participants with visual impairments for this study was quite a challenge. We recruited in the Syracuse, New York area, and their ages ranged from 30 to 80 plus. In the data analysis realm, we used what we called memoing, which was drafting notes during the study, reviewing, and then reflecting upon them. We regularly met with our research team to discuss the codes and to create affinity diagrams with post-it notes. And our research was in part informed by critical disability theories and relevant literature on such critical disability theories, particularly intersectionality. I will be happy to take any questions about that later on after the presentation, but I do not want to get into that deeply right now. Instead, though, I will turn it over to Smirity, and she will cover the results and discussion of our study more in depth.
Thank you, Jordan. So I will be presenting our results from our participants with visual impairment, starting with their self-perception of their disability identities. So we asked our participants with visual impairment about their self-perception of disability identities, mainly because it influences their behavior in everyday practices, which consequently affect their privacy and security in everyday life. So for instance, our participants reported selective disclosure of visual impairment. And to highlight this point, I would like to share an example from our participant P3, who is a retired educator and has low vision. So he struggles to answer his emails that come in large quantity, and what he does not want is broadcasting his visual impairment to everyone in his contact list. Rather, he wants to selectively disclose his visual impairment to only those people that he really wants to be in touch with. And this also serves like a practical utility for him to effectively manage his communications. Next, I would like to share our participants' self-definition of privacy. As we all know, there are many, but no agreed upon definitions of privacy. So instead of providing our version of privacy or our definition of privacy, we asked our participants with visual impairment and also their allies about how they would define privacy in their own terms. And this helped us in 2 ways. One, it helped us to contribute to the prior literature in this area, which really focuses on people with visual impairments' view of privacy. And number 2, it helped us to unpack our participants' privacy concerns in everyday life. So for instance, 3 of our participants with visual impairment defined previous slide, no worries. So 3 of our participants with visual impairment defined privacy in terms of ownership and control of their personal information, which subsequently give them a sense of security while performing their everyday tasks. Our allies also describe privacy in terms of their allyship with our participants with visual impairment. For instance, one of our ally participant, A1P1, defined privacy in terms of his allyship with our participant with visual impairment, P1. So he defines privacy in context of his allyship as he views the personal information as one's own property, that is P1's own property, and privacy as a right to protect that property. And overall, we saw that all these definitions shared a common theme of a desire to have more agency. And by that, we mean that by defining privacy as a personal control of their private information, they wish to exercise some sort of agency. Thank you. Now we're going to discuss our participants with visual impairments concerns for everyday privacy and security while using technology in 3 kinds of settings: the work settings, public settings, and home settings. While the prior literature extensively covers the concerns, privacy related and security related concerns in work and public settings, and we find similar results such as leaking of their personal information through enlarged computer screens or shoulder surfing and similar kinds of reported activities. The results from the home settings were somewhat unique and less studied in the prior literature. So in the home setting, we observed that while using technology devices, our participants were plagued by certain deceptive practices such as scams and viruses. And to highlight this point, I would like to share an example from our participant P1, who is legally blind. Thank you. So as you can see on the screen, our participant P1, while demonstrating to us how he logs into his email, he encountered a fake virus warning on his web browser, which the screen reader was unable to read. And his reaction was, "What's wrong? What's happening?" So this shows, or this observation highlights that although anybody can fall prey to such pop-up ads and scams, our participants with visual impairment were particularly vulnerable, especially if the screen reader does not read such pop-up warnings, and they may accidentally click such warnings and fall prey to such scams. Next, I would like to share our participants' social relationships and interactions. So our participant with visual impairment interacted with their allies, which formed a huge part of their everyday practices and consequently affected their privacy and security. So we divided these interactions into 6 domains, as you can see here. But for the brevity of this presentation, I will be focusing on the family relationships and the allies perspective. Before we dive into the family relationships and allies perspective, I would like to highlight that these interactions reflected an underlying nature of relationships which focus on agency, trust, and interdependence. Now, focusing on the relationship, family relationship, this included spouses, domestic partners, parents, children, and siblings. While in general, these relationships had a general sense of interdependence, mutual trust, and shared decision making, there were certain aspects, certain privacy concerns that our participants felt while asking for help from their family members. And to demonstrate this point, I would like to share an example from one of our participants, P4, who has low vision. So our participant P4, who has low vision, she hesitates to ask for help from her daughter when she has to fill some form which has financial information, such as her salary information. And she explains that although she trusts her daughter and her children in general with financial information, she feels that they may accidentally reveal that information to her ex-husband, which may put her at some sort of financial risk. So this highlights that although family members are trustworthy, but privacy concerns motivate our participants with visual impairment to ask for help in everyday mundane life, and how they would ask for what kind of help. Next, I would like to highlight our allies perspective, which was also an important contribution of the study. So each of our ally participants also had like really interesting and unique perspective about their relationship with our participant with visual impairment. For instance, A1P1, he respected P1's agency and advocated not to offer help unless P1 asked for help himself, for example, in case of laundry. And he also perceived P1 to be independent and manage most aspects of his life himself. And this and other examples, as you can see on the paper, and we're happy to answer more questions for such examples later on in the presentation. So this brings us to the implications for research and design. What can we learn from the insights of people with visual impairment and their interactions with their allies, and how that can help the privacy design and research in the future? So we notice that the existing tools focus on independence, where the emphasis is on individual, that the individual is going to protect his or her own privacy and will not rely on anyone else. Although we value such components, but we also would like to propose a more complementary solution, which is cooperative privacy management solution, by which we would like to call attention to the aspect of mutual assistance between people with visual impairment and their allies, so that together they can work towards a common goal of protecting the privacy and security of people with visual impairment. So, for example, what could a cooperative privacy solution look like? Well, it could look like a mobile app where people with visual impairment can share any information such as their daily schedules, any common task list with specific allies that they want to share that information with. They can also have real-time chat features while having full control over disclosing what kind of personal information they want to disclose. Lastly, we would like to share our implication focusing on the marginalized identities. So the multiple and intersecting marginalized identities that these individuals might have should also be the focus of such studies, mainly because the traditional privacy research study in this area of people with visual impairment tends to focus on a single marginalized identity, that is their visual impairment. However, the privacy design needs to consider the multifaceted and intersectional aspect of these people's marginalized identities. And one practical way of doing this is through participatory design and action research. Such an approach could engage these users throughout the design process and help the designers to learn more about their multiple identities. Lastly, we would also advocate a more inclusive approach where researchers are aware of their own potential biases and limitations and adopt a more socio-technical approach. At the end, we would like to thank our participants for their insights, anonymous reviewers and shepherds for their feedback, and the funding agencies for supporting this research. That's all for now. Thank you so much for your attention, and we are now open to questions.
Okay, so time for questions, and then if the next speaker could come and start setting up while we do the questions.
Oh.
You need to come up and come to the microphones. Sorry about that. So we've got one already, but we'll come back.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes. While I'm here, I'm a Westfield University of Bristol. I found it quite interesting, the example of where the fake virus thing pops up. I wondered if you looked at as to whether if the screen reader were to read it, were the users going to be equally susceptible than if it didn't?
Well, that's a very interesting view. So this particular observation we did while the predefined task towards the end of the session, and the aim of that predefined task was not to interrupt our user by testing other theories. So it was more about providing a more non-intrusive way of how they would interact with their systems. So we did not see if they would still be susceptible to such scams if the screen reader were to read it. So that is something that we can try probably in future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Were all your allies that participated, were those all in the home setting, or did you have any work setting allies, or were you able to investigate that at all and what the different considerations may have been?
We had one ally, P1. P1 had an ally, A1 P1, who was an office manager. but we saw that he was also his friend. So they worked together in the office, but A1P1 would also help him with tasks outside the office. So we saw that often such relationships were trustworthy and went beyond their socially constructed responsibilities, mainly because of the trusted relationship that had formed.
Hey, Dan Cosley, Cornell University and NSF. So I'm trying to think about whether this is really about their identities as someone who's visually impaired or some of the other intersexual identity components, or whether it's more about just the need to have collaborative use, right? It's like Helena Mentis has looked at, caregivers for older adults. Ishtiaq Ahmed has looked at, shared use for low literacy populations. I'm just wondering if like the same kinds of concerns and design prescriptions are going to show up in any setting where there's kind of, this sort of need to rely on other people to help you accomplish your tasks. And so I'd be curious to know what you think about that, how it applies to other kinds of caregiving or impairment situations. And since you invited me, Jordan, you invited us to ask about the intersectionality aspects, I'll go ahead and give you an opportunity to turn that question towards the intersectionality stuff if you want.
Thank you very much. From what I can understand, I think I don't know, each population is different, but if I had to guess, probably that this whole thing about intersectionality or these marginalized identities, that they can apply, in my opinion, I think they do apply to more than just people with visual impairments. I think any type of population, marginalized identity, whether it's gender, disability, race, or what have you, I think that's going to be more generalizable. And I think also when we look at the if we look at the interactions between the participants and the allies, I also think that's going to have more generalizability in regards to the interactions and the privacy and security implications of such. If you want to talk to us more about this, we'd be happy to talk to you in the open sessions or during any of the breaks.
Okay, great. So thank you again.